Over the past 10 months, we've been working with the GIZ Climate Smart Land Use team to review ASEAN land use guidelines and consider how other climate smart land use methods apply to ASEAN and contribute to climate change mitigation and adaptation. We will draw on these experiences and other work to answer two questions. What solutions are being successfully applied to ASEAN to address climate change and food security through land management? And what are key challenges for upscaling these approaches? As you are all well aware, climate change presents a number of challenges for all types of land use, like forestry, agriculture, livestock, and aquaculture. Hazards like coastal erosion, rising sea levels, changing precipitation patterns, and increased temperatures are negatively impacting food and nutrition security and farmer livelihoods. ASEAN member states have been working to address these challenges not only at the national level, but also regionally and in international negotiations. So before I go into specific land management methods, I'd like to first discuss the important role that guidelines play at the regional level. In ASEAN, guidelines are a policy tool that steer thematic areas of work by distilling global, regional, and national best practices in a way that is accessible to all ASEAN member states. The ASEAN Climate Resilience Network, for example, has utilized guidelines as a policy tool to communicate regional priorities and best practices that are used to address them. This is particularly apparent in volumes 1 and 2 of the Climate Smart Land Use Guidelines, which were endorsed at the ministerial level. This high-level endorsement signifies that there is agreement among ASEAN member states to pursue strategic direction, which, in this case, underscores the key linkages between agriculture and climate change action and provides a rationale for future activities. Over the past decade, the ASEAN Ministers of Agriculture and Forestry have endorsed an array of guidance documents and strategic frameworks on agriculture, food, fishery, and forestry issues. It also highlights that the ASEAN Secretariat is not there to monitor mandates, but rather lend guidance and provide support. So what does this mean for you at the national level when considering how to apply land management approaches? Well, first of all, there is a lot of information out there from the ASEAN Climate Resilience Network and from other partners like FAO, SEARCA, the World Agroforestry Center, and us here at SEI. ASEAN guidelines are often a good starting point, and as they provide clarity on what all ASEAN member states have identified as priority areas and facilitate and formalize knowledge exchange. They also provide rationale for future efforts and promote the scaling up and scaling out of policies and practices throughout the ASEAN region. Additionally, by engaging with regional guidelines, there are a number of opportunities to reach out for further support from partner organizations on the ASEAN Secretariat, and they also provide space for further guidance and technical support. So what does this mean for you at the national level when considering how to apply land management approaches? Well, first of all, there's a lot of information out there from the ASEAN Climate Resilience Network and from partners like FAO, SEARCA, the World Agroforestry Center, and of course us here at SEI. ASEAN guidelines are often a good starting point, and they provide clarity on what all ASEAN member states have identified as priority areas and facilitate and formalize knowledge exchange. They also provide a rationale for future efforts and promote the scaling up and scaling out of practices throughout the ASEAN region. They also provide opportunities to further support from partner organizations and the ASEAN Secretariat and provide a space to request further guidance and support. So now I'll move on to some climate smart land use practices that we've been working with to better understand in terms of their regional importance, climate change adaptation and mitigation potential, and the role of gender mainstreaming. So landscape approaches are important to climate change action in that they work to avoid further deforestation and wetland degradation, they increase the storage of carbon in soil and vegetation, and they aim to decrease current and future greenhouse gas emissions. Specific approaches need to be tailored to local contexts, and this requires an understanding of different types of land use in an area and how to balance competing demands that is best for human well-being and the environment. As such, in selecting an approach, it is important to have a multidisciplinary perspective that considers, among others, food security, livelihoods, finance, restoration, and climate change adaptation and mitigation. So, to do this, in our work, we have considered alternate wetting and drying for rice production, integrated agriculture, aquaculture systems, forest landscape restoration, sustainable soil management, silvopastoral systems, and climate information services. Many of these practices utilize integrated approaches to ensure land management practices are sustainable while able to adapt to climate change and lower greenhouse gas emissions. So, to do this, we considered how adaptation and mitigation play a role in these different types of land use. For example, alternate wetting and drying is not only an important water-saving technique for rice production, but also substantially reduces methane emissions, and while it does not reduce the rice production yields. Forest landscape restoration aims to regain ecological functionality while enhancing human well-being. And forests play a key role in climate mitigation through their carbon sequestration, and these approaches also can improve biodiversity and hydrology, contributing to adaptation. And finally, or as a final example, integrated agriculture-aquaculture systems increase household resilience, and in some cases can respond to increasingly saline soils and limited water availability, while also utilizing all farm and household byproducts as fish and animal feed rather than leaving them to rot and lead to greenhouse gas emissions. On the food security side, all of the approaches listed aim to ensure that climate change adaptation and mitigation actions, at the very least, do not reduce agricultural production, but in many cases have co-benefits like increased biodiversity and ecosystem services and reduced environmental degradation. The gender component is important, as gender equality is essential to eliminating hunger and achieving sustainable development, and is key to ensuring the effectiveness and sustainability of climate-smart land use projects. Women are often constrained by their limited access to extension services, credit, trainings, and information, and are often not involved in decision-making at the household, community, or institutional level. And these new projects provide an opportunity to involve women and men equitably, and ensure that the whole of community benefits from adaptation and mitigation technologies, and ensures that there's community buy-in. Finally, regional policy, or at the regional level, ASEAN member states have agreed to frameworks, guidelines, and strategic plans across different sectors that support various elements of these different methods relating to development, poverty eradication, gender, agriculture, climate change, and other land uses. Finally, our research aimed to further consider what needs to be done to improve policy action, the research needed to provide reputable evidence, and changes that might help improve implementation. So this brings me to my final section, which highlights what we have found as key challenges for upscaling climate change, climate-smart land use approaches. So, given that there are a lot of different policies and frameworks at the international level and regional and national levels, policy coherence is important to reduce conflicting incentives and other potential trade-offs. Landscape approaches are dependent on their local context. For example, alternate wetting and drying is only effective in certain conditions, and forest landscape restoration requires a broad, coordinated approach. The implementation of these practices will require an in-depth understanding of the local context and flexibility to evolve with new knowledge and as the context changes. Upscaling climate-smart plan practices requires years to fully implement and therefore needs sustainable financing and long-term planning and commitment. There are also some trade-offs that need to be considered, as increasing food demands are there along with a growing population, and agriculture plays an essential role in economic development. And so there can sometimes be trade-offs between productivity and mitigation. Finally, upscaling is most effective when it is supported by public investments in national programmatic support. At the farm level, many of these approaches require substantial startup costs, and sometimes, given the slow return of some projects, particularly in the forestry sector, financing mechanisms and investments may be difficult to secure. Finally, monitoring and evaluating landscape policies and projects can sometimes be challenging, but this component is essential to assess their success and enable the learning component. While there are a number of challenges in upscaling climate-smart land use practices, I'm excited to go through this leadership journey with you and consider how to address them. Now for a bit of an idea on how climate-smart land, or now that we have a bit of an idea on some different climate-smart land use practices and some challenges for upscaling implementation, I'll now turn to my colleague, Albert Salamanca, to discuss how policymakers can support and promote these practices.
How can policymakers promote or upscale these good practices? So there are a number of ways to do this. So one is that it will be useful to think in terms of partnerships, to identify your allies and people you can work with to promote these various good practices. The second is that you need to engage in creative communication using the social media platform as a way to promote these good practices. So you have to think in terms of ways in which your audience will appreciate how these good practices are going to be used. The third one is to think in terms of interlinkages to ensure the coherence of these practices across the policy landscape. So coherence is crucial because those practices are just part and parcel of what a particular agency or department is doing. So all this practice must be located within other policies of an agency or a government department. The fourth one are the so-called enablers. So you have to think also what would enable, especially in this situation in terms of climate resilience, because that's the focus of the whole set of interventions and practices. So that's why there are case studies. Case studies also look at mitigation, adaptation, as well as gender. So one is that you have to think in terms of the whole climate governance landscape so that you can find a hook, you can find a policy that could host those practices so that you can find support, and not only support also, but also funding for the rollout of these practices. Second is that in relation to climate governance, these practices could be the tools and strategies to implement the nationally determined contributions or NDCs or the national adaptation plans. So thinking about the NDC processes or the NAP processes within your country would help you upscale these good practices. And in relation to that, you also have to think in terms of your policy planning and processes, because each countries are unique in their approaches, and knowing how the policy planning works would help you when and where to advocate these good practices, and how also to support these good practices. And the third one among the enablers is, of course, one of the most important one is the issue of financing. Because for these good practices to be implemented, financing needs to be provided. And that's also the reason why we have to think about the governance itself. We have to think about the policy planning processes so that you would identify opportunities where budgetary allocations towards the implementation of these practices could be sourced. The final one is about science and assessment, or it's about knowledge production. Because as you implement these practices, you need to reflect about their success, about the extent to which they're being successful. So you need to monitor, you need to evaluate the implementations of these practices. In other words, you have to continually collect evidence to see whether the implementation of the practices have achieved or has achieved your objectives. In light of that, you need to also think about how knowledge will be continually produced to inform the implementation of these practices. Thank you.